So much for making the time to connect with me. Again, my name is Ron Rivers. This is going to be a presentation style talk on temporal naturalism, and I am just going to very briefly in the chat, let me throw it in here real quick. I'm just going to throw some resources, but I also throwing in a secondary room in case our Google Meet gets disrupted because I accidentally made this with a free account instead of a work account, which is fine. But this is just a brief introduction. So as I mentioned, the quick housekeeping for those who just arrived, we're not recording the session right now. This is a presentation style talk, so I'm going to dive into it. And on that note, let's dive in. I want to first talk about just the kind of contributors to this effort. So you are aware, temporal naturalism is not my individual idea. There's an academic tradition behind this. There's Roberto Mangabeira Unger, who's presently a scholar at Harvard, and there's Lee Smolin, who's a physicist. They kind of grounded this work with their efforts and kind of trying to imagine a genuine spiritual alternative. The kind of root problem is, all of us are aware, especially here in this liminal space, of the multitude of crises we're surrounded by. But I would argue that that's actually not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is not that we're here, but that we've lacked viable alternatives. And the root of the polycrisis, meta-crisis is ultimately a crisis of imagination. So today we're going to kind of discuss it. So Roberto and Lee Smolin kind of laid the foundation. I, in my efforts, wrote Self-actualization in the Age of Crisis and Becoming More, which is a graphic novel about it. And basically what I kind of took their initial kind of core theories and gave it a more robust shape and direction towards the realizing the vision in the world. So with that said, let's dive into the agenda for today. We're going to talk about why is a spiritual alternative necessary? What is the purpose of that? We'll talk about the core principles of temporal naturalism. We'll talk about the cosmology and physics, very briefly, high level behind it, the grounding of how we ground our theory and orientation. We'll talk about divinity and the self. And then we'll talk about individual and systemic actualization, and then the living practice of them. So let's dive in right away. We'll start talking about why a spiritual alternative. So to genuinely discuss this, we should all kind of coalesce around a definition of spirituality, which is very difficult to do, given the nature of spirituality and our own individual kind of orientations in the world. But with that said, I'm going to use the definition for this talk that spirituality is defined as the relationship between the agental observer and the perpetually unfolding world. So where spirituality differs from most things, it's the concept or framing that deals with all things, right? It deals with how we experience the world around us. Now, all spiritual traditions, all wisdom traditions have many kind of different components to them, but ultimately, I would argue that they attempt to address three core aspects of the human experience, which is groundlessness, otherwise known as doubt. Groundlessness is the idea of what's the point, right? We're doing all this work, well, why? What is the point of life, and how come I never feel deeply at home? Insatiability, which is desire, the idea that we are attracted to the shiny object, and then we get the shiny object, and then 2 weeks later, it's just an object. And there's another shiny object on the horizon. So there's an aspect of being human where there's this perpetual want that arises. And then death. And I would argue that death is ultimately the root of all metaphysics. And in many ways, while each of the historical wisdom traditions have differentiators about how they go about this, I would argue that the pattern of failure, or ultimately where they lack across all of them, is the same, which is that they seek to resolve these tensions rather than holding them. They offer certainty against doubt, right? Transcendence against desire, and then immortality against death. Immortality in a concept that we can actually never truly know. So with temporal naturalism, we do something different. We take the openness of time seriously, and we live with those in our life rather than attempting to escape them. Ultimately, the vision behind why do we want to explore new religious and spiritual traditions is to kind of decouple our capacity to transform from crisis. I would argue that historically, the most profound human transformations have been built upon crises. But I think we would all be in consensus that that's not the ideal. So how do we develop frameworks of meaning and value and imagination that allow us to transform without reliance on crisis, and ultimately prioritize a form of humanity where our birth lottery is not the most important event in our lives? And I think it's arguable that today that the opposite is true. Like where you are born and who you are born to has the most outsized impact on the trajectory of your life. Ultimately, I would argue that a new spiritual tradition is needed, a religion of the future, so to speak, to free the latent imagination that's trapped in the world. And I think that is at the root of all of the kind of collective work many of us are doing in all of our own directions, is an attempt to how are we freeing more imagination to participate in the world today? Because much of it remains trapped within these creations of our own making. Let's dive into the core principles of temporal naturalism. This is kind of like the work of Unger and Smolin, like where they really grounded the philosophy. So there's 5 core principles. The first is the nature of reality. So the most important feature of the world is that it is what it is instead of something else. Now that might sound obvious, but it's not. Most of our inherited frameworks of meaning and value are built on the assumption that the world has a deep structure that makes it necessary, right? That things are the way they are because they must be. But temporal naturalism rejects that in its entirety. The universe is not arranged to suit our concerns or desires. What is real is often alien to us. And we as human beings, it's our tendency to kind of desire to represent them as like arranged to kind of meet or suit our advantages. But ultimately, this is the beginning of a deep illusion that we embody. Metaphysics in general wants to show us the way the world must be. But I argue, and you'll hear this throughout the talk, that the world is surprising, right? It conforms to no model. So we inhabit a relational universe, right? It's like the way we understand anything is by understanding what it can become. All right, so each of us are distinct, right? We're never separate from our relationships, our systems, our histories, the environments that shape us. But who we are is formed through interaction. Our actions affect others, and the actions of others continuously shape our lives in return. Time isn't a static frame matter exists within. It's intrinsic to what matter is, right? Everything is what it is only because it can become something else. So you and I, we're not who we are despite of our capacity to change, but because of it. And to grow most fully and most deeply embedded in the nature of reality as it is, we have to see ourselves both as individually responsible, but also inseparably embedded within the larger systems surrounding us. And I'll dive into like what that means at a greater length in a bit. The second component of temporal naturalism is the inclusive reality of time and changing causality. So I'm going to define time, because time is like a lot of times when I've given talks around this, everyone kind of comes into the talk with kind of a predefined notion of what they believe time is. But time, in terms of cosmology and physics, we're going to label it as the universe's capacity for change, right? The transformation of transformation, the perpetual state of becoming and unfolding. All of our cosmological observations in the history of the universe imply change. So I want to make that argument that time, therefore time must be real. Nothing is immune from change, including change itself. So what I mean by that is that the frequencies, the degrees, the variations of change can also transform and have historically in our cosmological history. So to make it explicitly clear, nothing in the history of the universe has ever not been changing. Now, a lot of times we create these tools, let's say, for example, mathematics and logic, and both are extremely powerful tools. but we shouldn't confuse them with reality itself, which is perpetually evolving, right? So with mathematics as an example, mathematics is a tool that does two core things, right? It either measures, which is past, or predicts, which is future. There's no mathematical formula for now. And this is core because we want to avoid confusing our local successes. And when I say local successes, this can be academic and scientific successes, but it can also be in our interpersonal world. You know, we do something and it works. We want to avoid confusing local success with cosmic necessity. The idea that because it worked here, it must be the same uniformly throughout the cosmos. So as individuals, we can kind of embrace this and apply it to our lives by not confusing our desire to make sense of the world with the idea that all of our observations must make sense. Those are two different things. So we'll move on to the emergence of the new. Our freedom, our imagination, and our power to transform our circumstances, is defined by the emergence of the new. Novelty repeatedly emerges through our cosmic, natural, and human history, right? It defies deterministic and static models of the universe. So things becoming new is real, and it's a very real part of nature. If emergence were impossible, right? If new things genuinely could not emerge, if the universe were truly fixed, then our freedom would be a total illusion. But emergence is not rare. It is a fundamental character of reality. So causal connections, right, both random and intentful, they reshape our world at every turn, and each new transformation lays the foundation for new emergences, right? So every new kind of a rising of the now comes with a whole new sense of potentialities, a whole new sense of possibility. So in this same vein, like we understand that history precedes structure, right? Nothing inherited at this moment is permanent. We can apply to our system. Like economy is not a law of nature. The state is not inevitable. These are artifacts of history, but history keeps on moving. Move on to the idea of there's the fourth component, which is there's no kingdom within a kingdom. So temporal naturalism is a secular spiritual tradition. The idea is that it's a naturalistic orientation that tries to reduce our reliance on the illusion of metaphysics or the supernatural. It takes what is real as natural and tries to discard the rest. So as a naturalistic orientation, we understand that humans are not apart from nature, like exceptional, removed from it, but rather we are one link in a myriad of spectrum of existence. So it's not that we care for each other because we're made in God's image. We care for each other because we are part of a nature that can do that. Any idea about predeterminism, or as you'll hear me refer, deep structure, that forces us either to reject our experience, like what we actually experience as an illusion, or forces us to claim that we are some sort of mysterious exception to what the universe is like, to what the world is like. And we reject that. And finally, the fifth kind of core element of temporal naturalism is against the reverence of nature. So we want to oppose the impulse to worship reality or to view it as moving towards some inevitably perfect or predetermined end. When we revere nature, instead of engaging with it in a kind of creative experience, it's actually a form of submission. We submit to what is, and we pretend it's some sort of spiritual depth. We say, well, this is the way, so I'll embrace it for what it is. But the idea that there's some sort of ultimate, final, complete end, it positions us in a metaphysics where the less time-bound things are, the more real they are. For example, like the idea of the timeless Godhead. And this being is a manifest illusion, right? It denies all observations of the world. And I would argue it's a form of self-deception. Ultimately, it's this kind of power worship that we disguise under the guise of piety, that we say it makes us more spiritual, to kind of remove ourselves from the world that we observe as it is. So those are the core principles. I want to move next into the universe having a story. So I'm going to keep this kind of high level, but this is essentially what we understand is the changing nature of time and the materially infinite universe we inhabit. So I'll give a quick cosmological graph, and we'll go back for a sec. But what we're looking at right now, you've probably seen this before, but this is basically the most commonly used presently understanding of the universal expansion, or the expansion of our universe. So what you see in that kind of white dot all the way on the left is like the initial quantum fluctuations. You have this inflation period, that's this white space right here. I don't know if you can see my mouse on the screen. But that white space is a period that we refer to the Planck epoch. Now, the Planck epoch is fundamental in our understanding of the nature of reality, because all of the laws governing our reality today were different during the Planck epoch. So they transformed. It's a breakdown of laws. It's, mathematically, once we get there, we can't measure beyond it. So it's this breakdown of what we understand nature to be, and what we for long understood nature to be as kind of a static system. We understand now, oh no, the rules governing reality evolved over time. As matter began to cool and separate, so too did the rules governing reality transform. Now, the challenge is that we think like physics and cosmology, general relativity, quantum mechanics, quantum field theory. These are all standard models of particle physics, but none of them have failed in experimental tests, right? Every time you test them, they're accurate towards your predictions. So we as humans are systems thinkers, right? We organize processes into patterns, and then we repeat them so we can identify and eventually manipulate them. And this instills almost like a mechanical perception of the universe. And that's kind of earlier when I talked about like non-locality. We project the success of like what works here on Earth into the totality of the universe. But that's a very significant error, right? It makes us and forces us to kind of believe that our creations are natural and necessary. And I would argue they are not. They are not. So it's worth noting. I'll just make a quick note. In Self-actualization, the Age of Crisis, I made the argument, I published it in 2011. I made the argument for an infinite material universe, leaning into Roger Penrose's observations of the cosmic microwave background. However, in 2024, a series of studies came out and said, the measurements might have been a bit off. It's not as concrete as I believed it to be. But the flip side is I'll share that since 2011, physics and cosmology have repeatedly strengthened the argument that we inhabit an infinite material universe. And without getting too into the weeds, it's because there's a near zero spatial curvature, which means the universe is not a ball. It doesn't curve. It's not, you can go around it. It seems to be a flat plane that just extends indefinitely. Space does not, there's no compact topology, which basically means that it doesn't look like it wraps around, like I mentioned. And then our inflation-like primordial structure, which I mentioned earlier. And I can source, I have the journal articles for all this stuff if it's of interest for people. So ultimately, we understand that the universe is not a structure, but a process. Okay, so when we think about the nature of reality, it is neither fixed nor random. It's a process without a predetermined trajectory, but it's genuinely and structurally open. And that goes back to that concept of novelty. The new can emerge. The future is not predetermined. So that brings us to kind of the next point, which is how do we define and how do we relate this? There we go. How do we relate this to our daily lives? Right. This is great, a kind of great foundation for what is real. But we have to ask ourselves the question: if our observations of nature throughout our collective history of observing tell us that some of the most foundational metaphysical beliefs are not accurate, we have that choice, right? We can say, well, we're going to deny our observations of the world, or again, with temporal naturalism being a naturalistic alternative, we say, okay, well, how do we ground a form of spirituality that embraces what is? So where we have to ask ourselves, like, where do we encounter this openness that is reality and nature, and not abstractly, but in the texture of our individual lived experience? I would make the argument that we're all these, each of us are these finite beings, right? We give death its due. We say there is an expiration. We are finite, and we're embedded in these processes that frankly exceed our comprehension in every direction, right? Cosmologically, temporally, socially, ecologically. It's very difficult for any individual or even collections of individuals to genuinely wrap their head around the nature of reality. And that inexhaustibility is not a problem to be solved. It is a condition of a genuine spiritual life. So in Self-actualization, the Age of Crisis, I make the argument that there are two observable infinities. And I want to define infinity. Well, I'll share them and then I'll kind of define what I mean by that. There essentially are two places in nature where infinity presents itself not as a mathematical breakdown, but as a direct encounter. The universe itself, which, whose unfolding basically exceeds any frame we impose upon it, and human imagination, which cannot be exhausted from the inside. I make the argument that the alignment of these two represent divinity in its most raw form. So when we think about the historical wisdom and religious traditions, one of my critiques is that they posit, let's say, for example, the monotheistic religions, the Abrahamic religions, the idea of heaven. Heaven posits divinity only after death, so we can never really know it. I would argue that genuine divinity is experiential. It is something that we can access within our lives, and it's through the alignment of those two observable infinities. And that's when you align imagination with the universe itself, it's most commonly referred to as the flow state. It's like when life becomes effortless and your labor, your efforts, your focus and energy, which at many times can be a taxing output, is quite the opposite. It is part of one sec, so I should admit someone. It is quite the opposite. It is very much about how we frame we become more godlike in that process. Now, when we think about that as a spiritual grounding, right? If we can access divinity, and if we believe that divinity and that access to divinity, that alignment of infinity, is an integral part of nature that we can access, the question has to become, well, spiritually, what is our responsibility to ourselves and to the other to maximize the capacity of the collective to engage in that practice? Because I would argue that within the institutions that we've surrounded ourselves, our creations, we have an ever decreasing amount of people who can genuinely participate in the world. So, I don't have all my slides. Anyway, therefore, when we think about the nature of the self and how we relate and how we orient ourselves within an unfolding infinite universe that supports and strengthens novelty, we have to think of spirituality in the context of binding the spirit in the system, because the systems that we are surrounded by are inseparable from our experience, right? So we break the practice into seeking to realize two distinct moral agendas. So there's individual actualization, which is the development of the self, I, and there's systemic actualization, which is the development of the collective, we. Because I strongly believe and would argue that we recognize any individual is most powerful when the collective can exercise their imagination freely and as frequently as possible. That is to say that it's like a rising tide lifts all boats, right? The idea is that if only a select few are able to participate in the imaginative agenda of society, they themselves are hindered by the fact that many cannot. So individual actualization is the process of kind of how we embrace temporal naturalism and integrate into our own lives and our own practice. So individual actualization in Self-Actualization, the Age of Crisis, I write, it's a pretty deep book. You can see it in the chat. If you're interested in kind of going through all of the frameworks I speak about, you can explore it. I don't have time to go through everything today, but I'm going to highlight kind of the core aspects. And when we think about individual actualization, we recognize that all of us inherit a world where the primary means of interaction with others are self-assertion and competition, right? The most common form of interaction is transaction. So the way we interact with strangers most commonly is through exchange. So today, and I think in this specific moment today, right, we understand the full depths of depravity that arise from this orientation. So individual actualization is our kind of approach to how do we break free from the programming. So in Self-Actualization, the Age of Crisis, I write about the idea of deep cooperation. I write about the idea of modern shamanism, ritualistic practice. But the two things I want to kind of focus on today are A, the core values, and B, the development of mastery. But basically, if we live in this materially infinite universe and we want to kind of orient ourselves towards a naturalistic spiritual orientation, the question is, well, what are the values that we hold personally to guide us in these moments? So that's where I kind of develop these core values. The acronym for remembering them is simple. It's reframe courage. I'm going to go through each of them at a high level. But basically, relation is the belief and practice of applying our knowledge of a relational universe, that there's no separation to our interactions with others, right? There are no separate events in nature. So we apply this by grounding our spirituality in a universal interconnectivity. I think at Limicon, I'm probably preaching to the choir, with this specific value, but it is important to codify it and use it within our ritual practice for ourselves to align those observable infinities. Equity is the belief and practice of fairness in our personal and systemic relationships. So we apply this by questioning if our interactions with others are rooted in fairness and mutual divinity, or are we seeking to, are we unintentionally or intentionally seeking to extract? Because that grounding of the relationship is paramount for how we organize and cooperate with others. Flexibility is our belief and practice of not projecting our desires onto a specific moment, right? We embrace the moment as it arises without expectation. And then we orient ourselves around the ideal from there. So it's basically, we focus on our actions, not the outcomes. We embrace our lack of control over the greater circumstance and recognize that no single moment could ever reflect your expansive divinity. You possess, right? Each of us, again, to be embodied in divinity and to be embodied in the infinite means that we are both of it, right? We're an aspect of it, but we also are within it. It happens to us. So that's a core aspect of that. Restraint is the belief and practice in exercising disciplined choice. So we apply that in our lives, both within our personal habits, how we organize our own lives, but also in our interactions with others. There is no escaping that in an infinite universe where novelty exists, choices matter. And I think there is sometimes we want to, perhaps in a spiritual sense, kind of dissociate ourselves from that, especially if we believe in, for example, predeterminism. But I think that's a dangerous, and again, I think it's a form of kind of like power worship that we wrap in piety to say that our choices don't matter, because they obviously do. In the universe, whether it be through the measurement of quantum states, etc., the choices that we make have a direct impact on the universe. Awareness is the belief and practice of elevating our perception within and of the totality of experience. So it's like training ourselves. One habit I write about is a small ritual in self-actualization, the Age of Crisis. It's just 5 breaths, like a very simple habit, right? But are you are you of the capacity and the practice to genuinely bring your awareness to the moment? Because it is so, many of us, as we come to any situation with a history of priors, we apply those orientations subconsciously to the event, and then we make decisions based on that. But our ideal is to be able to, whenever necessary, to bring our awareness to the now, because the better we are at bringing our awareness to the now, the better we are shifting our focus and energy in a specific direction, right? Um, any direction of focus and energy is an act of becoming. Dr. Ian McGilchrist writes that attention is a moral act, which I strongly agree with, right? This is the process of becoming. And I think when we conceptualize it in that nature, we understand that our power over our own awareness and our capacity to separate ourselves from our adherence to the moment is one of the most powerful tools an individual can have within their repertoire. Minimalism is the belief and practice of eliminating the unnecessary, right? We want to avoid acquiring the unnecessary, and we want to ground our happiness, our fulfillment in the development of ourselves and our networks. That's easier said than done in such a materialistic society as many of us have kind of grown into. Enthusiasm is the belief and practice of fully immersing ourselves in our undertakings. And the idea is that whatever you do, you want to throw yourself into it. You want to learn to love the journey of becoming more. I have a 5-year-old daughter. She's going to be 6 soon. And, we're getting to the phase where she's starting to develop her own interests. And one of the things I always talk to her about, I've been very vocal about is, I am unconcerned with the direction she chooses, so long as she raises a storm, so long as she throws herself with her full heart and effort into the efforts that she is passionate about. Because that is, without a doubt, the most direct path to fulfillment in life. The most direct path towards happiness is embracing life with a genuine enthusiasm. And that, I know that's difficult. That's easier said than done, especially in the context of what we presently know about the organization of global power structures, etc., within the world. But it is one of our greatest tools. And then finally, courage, the last element of the core values, is the belief and practice of fearlessness in the face of the unknown. So we want to decouple failures from emotion. Right? We want to recognize that our greatness and our development of our godlike powers occurs through choice within a moment. And in times of doubt, it's always vital to remind yourself why you are working towards your vision of the good and why you are doing what you are doing, because there is an ultimate underlying why. Now, here's the thing. With any set of values, you would expect an outcome. But with these specific core values, I make the argument that if you genuinely embrace them, it's going to create a restlessness within you. Whereas the present institutions, the present circumstances are untenable. They're simply not enough. And it drives you to act. And I think when we think about a spiritual orientation that recognizes nature for what it is, this perpetually infinite unfolding process that we possess a small aspect of within us, but again, are of it, it orients us in a way where the mission and the values that we live become much larger than ourselves and much larger towards, working towards some divinity we can never know. And that, I think, is a core side of a strong value structure, especially within the context of the moments we presently inherit. The other core thing I'll just mention at a high level around individual actualization is the idea of soulcraft. And soulcraft is the development of the self. I define it very simply as routine, discipline, and mastery. Understand that the self is not given, but it's made. And that identity is a practice rather than a possession. It's not something you own. It is something you create alongside the relationships you have in the world. Discipline is not the enemy of emergence, right? It's the condition for it. I think of a musician who's mastered their instrument is more free. They're not less, right? Structure creates the ground from which genuinely novelty can arise. I can share from my personal experience, I've developed mastery in a few directions. Probably the most expressive in my existence is I had a 25-year wrestling career. And I can tell you from without a doubt that it is the most fun and most creative after you've gotten past the the grind that kind of goes with it. So there is an element of mastery, but mastery is what we should seek towards the fullest recognition of our divinity, the fullest recognition of our powers. Moving on, I want to talk about systemic actualization. So, and we're going to kind of wrap it up soon after this. Systemic actualization, first, let me define system, because that's a pretty broad topic. A system is any creation that governs the relationships between two or more people. And that can be varied, right? Economics is a system. Law is a system. Politics is a system. Religion, organized religion, is a system. But every system bears the temporal imprint of the moment of its creation in two distinct ways. The first is its intended purpose, and the second is the values embodied by its creator. Now, for any of you who've ever created systems before, you know that the moment you release a system into the world, it begins to deviate from its intended purposes. People use it for objectives and intents that were not initially assigned to it. But there is systemic actualization represents the belief in alignment with our core values and in alignment with the observable infinities in a time-bound universe, that our moral and material interests are inseparable. So the question becomes, who is most well suited to act, right? What happens to your body, your neighborhood, your access to clean water, right? These are not pre-spiritual concerns to be addressed before the spiritual work can begin. They are the spiritual work. And ultimately, temporal naturalism is a framework for taking back the power that we have given our creations over us. Now, I mentioned earlier that one example is that transactions are most common interaction, but money is a poor social glue. Right? It coordinates behavior, but it doesn't bind people through genuine difficulty. So the value structure creates the conditions for trust under pressure. And that's a core element of how we kind of transcend these various crises, is how are we orienting our values and our vision in a specific direction. I wrote in the book a lot about self-changing systems and the abandonment of maximalist approaches to organization design. And we're going to dive deeper into this. I have another talk on Thursday. I hope you can attend. It's the structural component of this realized. Basically, we have to understand that the future of systems is designing systems that build for their own capacity for transformation, right? If you think about the traditional corporate structure, it believes in like a deterministic, predetermined function of the universe. It's static. There's a rigid power structure. But they don't optimize for a fixed end state, but they do optimize for like a fixed end state. But the ideal is that we want to maintain the conditions for ongoing adaptation, ongoing transformation. And this is like an institutional expression of temporal naturalism principles. The abandonment of maximalism follows naturally a maximalist system, right? One that tries to govern everything and optimize everything and resolve every tension is a system that's confused itself for reality. So we want to be able to bind our spiritual values to the realization of global public works. So the 8 dignities represent the spiritual structural component of temporal naturalism. The idea that it's not enough to have an embodied practice that only serves us individually. We must embody a framework of spirituality that serves to transform the other, especially the other, let's say, that doesn't have the material circumstances, conditions that some of us on the call may or may not have. I do want to emphasize, I'm going to go over them kind of high level, but the 8 dignities are a suite of global public works. They are, you can kind of see in the image, they're food and water, housing, healthcare, education, transportation, communication, and energy. So when we think about the 8 dignities, these kind of suite of global public works, they represent a genuine alternative in a world where the price of participation is extreme. It's very the risk and potential failures of participating in the world are very high today. And we want to, in alignment with the observable infinities and helping others realize those observable infinities and align them within a moment, we want to create a framework for expanding our experimentalist impulses at scale. Right? We want a world where as many people as possible have the capacity to experiment and have the capacity to transform the world in their own vision of the good. I want to emphasize that they're not intended to be charity or welfare. They're not intended to be a promise of success or equality of outcomes. Personally, I would argue that equality of outcomes are both unachievable, but also undesirable. And the 8 dignities serves as a framework for a global public work structure that unbinds individual rights from the state. Because when we consider our present circumstance, and going back to the initial comments I made in the very beginning about birth lottery, where we are born has such an outsized impact on our capacity to act and transform the world, because our rights are bound to a specific geophysical location. How do we imagine a form of humanity where you are granted the most advanced capacity to act, the agency and the resources necessary for no other reason than being born? Right? Where we genuinely recognize the divinity of the other through those circumstances. And ultimately, I would argue that the 8 dignities, if we are able to create a functioning network of services that support these, it is a framework for freeing the latent imagination in the world. I'll give you one brief example, because I obviously, as someone who loves to speak about these things, obviously believe strongly in living my values. So recently, over the last year, I partnered with the Austin Housing Coalition and the City of Austin, and basically I built an operationalized AI infrastructure to serve their affordable housing crisis. So they have in Austin, Texas, they have a ton of affordable housing. When I say affordable, I mean like voucher-based, income-based housing, units that are vacant, but they have a huge homelessness crisis. So we essentially built an infrastructure through the nonprofit. I only charged them, what it was worth, what it cost to build, and since then we've just renewed it for the 2nd year. It's got hundreds of monthly users per month, and now we're meeting people where they are. So when we think about how do we realize the 8 dignities, it doesn't have to be global scale only, right? We can transform the world through local efforts and transforming the local infrastructure, which will kind of build the foundation upon. So it's just one example of how could we actually apply this vision of the 8 dignities to our spiritual purpose as temporal naturalists. So again, ultimately it represents a genuine alternative to the world and more fully realizes the relationship between spirit and structure and our effort to bind the two to kind of help humans transcend the circumstances we've inherited. I'm not going to go into this, but I will share the slides if it's of interest. This is a comparative analysis of how temporal naturalism compares to monotheism, spiritual orientations that embrace a timeless reality, etc. So it comes with a bunch of dimensions. It's just a fun kind of chart. And then we'll talk about living practice. So when we get into the living practice, I'm just going to say briefly that some of you may or may not have heard of Spirit DAO. Spirit DAO is the Church of Temporal Naturalism, but it really is a community of communities. We organize the church as a church for the kind of financial benefits. But ultimately, Spirit DAO was initially written about when I published the book. It was the last chapter of Self-actualization, the Age of Crisis in 2011. So now here we are 5 years later, and on Thursday, I'm going to be revealing it live for the first time. So it's our formal launch here at Limicon. And it is an infrastructure for self-sovereign communities and self-sovereign and high agency individuals, basically. It allows communities to kind of write their own rules and kind of orient themselves around their kind of shared vision of the good while coalescing all of the communities within the ecosystem towards a shared direction. But to conclude, I'll say kind of 2 things. And then it's a good time to open it up to kind of questions or comments or critiques. A lot of times when we think about being bold enough to share genuine visions of alternatives in the world, we're kind of met with 2 kind of core critiques, right? That first, it's not enough, or second, that it's too utopian. I believe, and I've tried to express during this discussion, presentation, that we have kind of found that middle ground where we found something that is not too utopian. The 8 days are not too utopian. In fact, I would argue today they're more possible than they've ever been. But it's also distinctly different, right? It orients humanity in a distinctly different direction. And the critic, what they embrace ultimately is they want to maintain the present trajectory. But what they fail to understand, and what I hope I can leave you with, is that in our daily lives, it can sometimes be frustrating about the pace of change, the scope of change. We have to remember that as human beings, in our embodied humanity as it presently stands, change is always going to be incremental. We only have so many moments within a day that we can exercise towards a specific direction. But the direction of our change is not incremental. The direction of our change can be a 90-degree angle. It can shift in any frequency or direction we want, in any intensity, and the direction matters most. So as we consider temporal naturalism as a spiritual alternative, if this has resonated with you, or if it's just of interest, take away that when we frame reality as it is, I believe it is a much more empowering orientation of the world, especially when we think about how do we decouple our capacity for change from crisis. Because today, I would argue, and historically, most human transformation drives itself from crises, like the ones we inhabit today. But that cannot be the ideal, and we have to imagine an alternative. So, on that note, I have said a lot. I appreciate your sharing space with me, sharing the field. I hope this was resonant, and I do want to open it up for comments or questions or just a deep breath. I know I need a breath for a moment, but I am going to open up space. I also do want to just kind of point out, if you haven't seen already, I did pop in a Google Meet 2 because we may go over time. And thank you, Lee. I deeply appreciate that, and I'm humbled. So if we go over time, I'll just shout, hey, if you're still interested in kind of exploring the questions, just hop in that meet. We don't have to do it right now, but just put it out there because it may be. Let me stop sharing. I'll come up here. And just a reminder, we have not recorded this. So if you want to ask questions, you're not going to be recorded. Victor, please. You are welcome to hop up and share.
I want to ask if everyone would come off of mute with me and do something that feels maybe a bit weird to do on Zoom, but like, uh, dude, please. That um that landed a lot differently than like reading the book the first time through, Ron. That was exceptionally resonant. A lot of really high signal. Um, that's all I wanted to say. There's so much I could say that was resonant, and you could even talk about some things that weren't. But like, I want to participate, so I'm looking forward to Thursday. Thank you, dude.
Well, deeply humbled, Victor. Thank you. That's the first Zoom call I've got. I wish I was recording now, to be honest. That's the ego in me coming out.
Oh no, I recorded for you.
Oh, thank you, Victor. Awesome.
Okay.
That's what I've done. Welcome, Fahim. We're just wrapping up. But I do want to invite anyone else to speak. But of course, if there's nothing else to say, if we just want to process and digest, I'm happy to do that as well. The one ask I'll make of everyone, if you enjoyed this talk, I really am. I'm going to make a little brief video. I am thrilled about Thursday coming up. I was sharing with Victor when he first entered. This has been, for me, Thursday is going to be the culmination of like a 9-year journey, and I'm just so elated to be able to share it with everyone. So if it's within your power and presence to be there, it's this Thursday at the same time. I would take it as a personal favor for everyone just to show up. I'm just so excited to kind of share because um, I deeply believe that, as I mentioned in the very opening statement, the biggest problem is like not that we're here, but like we've lacked like a viable alternative to kind of transcend the systems that be. And I've been focused on like decentralized micro communities for some time in both my professional and personal work. And I think we've built something extremely special, and I'm just thrilled to share it. So that's my one ask, if anyone is able to do that. Again, I'll pause if anyone wants to comment or critique, etc. You're welcome.
I want to share that like I came across a local. There's one of my neighbors just down the street works in the town council. He was elected this last cycle. When I was talking with him about um, you know similar like interests in community organizing, what he was talking about was the youth. He was talking about above all like the crisis of meaning. Being able to make meaning in life, right?
Hmm.
So the part of pursuit of not, I mean, so many things hit the nail, but or like really resonated. But the bit of like meaning coming from uh, being able to act in service, to what one cares about, right? And to be able to pursue a kind of mastery of like interacting with reality, I think is really beautiful. Um, there's a bit that feel that like people tend to focus on when we talk about meaning, which is like you know um, something about
Victor,
like the Godhead. Oh well, there's so
I'm
much.
sorry to interrupt you. I know I
Yeah,
want to continue and I want to hear
yep,
you, but let's move to meeting two. I'm sorry,
let's do
everyone.
it.
My Google hole is dropping, so I have a separate meeting set up. You just click it. Hopefully, I'll see many of you over there. If not, I hope you have a wonderful day, and thank you so much for joining me. So again, Victor, I'm sorry. You were talking about engagement with the world as a framework for present spirituality.
From for finding meaning, and also there's this um, I don't know, what's with me is having listened to this episode of Daniel Thorson's Emerge podcast where he's talking with Jordan Greenhall at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But they were just towards the end getting towards meaning, and like it's worth listening to. It's really related to this concept, I think, of like mastery and of like um, being able to engage with the world in in an impactful way. But then there's like this other the thing that came up for me while listening to this, and I don't know if was the other part, like not just sort of meaning through agency or care, but like encounter with the divine, or and um, the thing that shifted for me was like the sense of agency of the agent and acting with reality, like that is meaningful to be able to cause, to have creative effect. But the other part is of that user, or of the agent, or the person, not of having an agentic encounter with reality, but instead of feeling held by it, of feeling held by um, you know by reality, or by cosmos or something like that. Now, this relates, by the way, to something that the thing that like pricked me, or like that I found like I wasn't quite aligned with. And it was it was like one of the first couple of slides. Maybe you can show me.
Yeah, yeah. Let me share them,
But
please.
you're going through maybe like five different principles. I think it was the
Oh, the,
principles.
the the central principles of temporal
Yeah.
naturalism.
And it
Sure. Give
was
me
like
one.
the last one that I was like, well, maybe there's something in there, but like the thing uh, that I've found really significant for me is in my life is like that experience of choosing. Yeah. So the against reverence
The
of
reverence of
nature.
nature.
Yeah, there's a, I mean, I can hold it. I think I was able to receive it the way that you intended it. And so I don't have an objection, to it, like, as it's framed. The bit that I find maybe a little bit beyond this is like that experience of like having a felt sense of trust that the universe actually is, benevolent in some sense, that I can encounter it that way, and, therefore like kind of don't need to be self-referentially continuously watching myself and
Mm,
watching why I'm doing things, but instead engaging with reality, you know, feeling like I'm inherently trustworthy because, you know, I don't need to explain or I get to participate because I feel like I'm in resonance with something that's larger than me.
I completely. So I feel like that's a really kind of fascinating point, and I think one of the things that I'll share with you is that you know I wrote this 5 years ago. It's kind of the original theory about it, right? And since then, and without getting kind of like too depressing, you know, I've been exposed to the Epstein files. I've been to, exposed to, Satanistic Kabbalism and like magic. And I've actually read, I just finished reading the Doctrine and Ritual of High Magic, which is like an occult text from 1950 or 1850 France, which is like, had like a cult revival. So I think maybe like 5 years ago, I might have argued for a more kind of rigid approach, but I'm kind of leaning into like magic and like that element of like alignment can be very real. The one thing
Mhm.
I would say
Mhm.
is vital is like um, because I act personally in my life. I genuinely feel this way with an extreme degree of trust, even to the stranger, right? Perhaps to a point of detriment, but I'm an embodied individual who can do that. I'm not at fear. As I mentioned, my wrestling career, I'm not at fear for like my physical safety. I'm not, I'm not in fear. So I'm able to kind of interact with the world with an extreme trust. And to your point, I feel that that is reciprocated, right? Now, is that reciprocated because the universe wants it, or is it reciprocated because we exist in a field and I am subconsciously manipulating the field or maybe consciously, right, by entering into approaches. I don't, I think what I call temporal naturalism and non-religion. To be honest, it's like as I grow, as I have a family. I mentioned my 5-year-old. I become less and less interested with like convincing people it's right. It's quickly becoming like not at all a concern of mine. I'm more into the structural, like how are we realizing it. I think the one caveat that I would say, and I see this with a lot of people who I've met in the spiritual circles who believe in like predeterminism, like all of it's written, right? The problem with that is like when you really get into like the universe wants good and it wants good and it has these things, is that if you live a life where you have a chain of experiences that are, let's say,
Mhm,
not
mhm, mhm. If you
right.
win the birth lottery, I mean, like you're more likely to just sort of, engage with reality that way and not realize yeah. So there, I agree. There's a lot of there's nuance, and you've, you know, compressed that into like a single sentence, principle, and so there's only so much nuance that can be baked into it. But yeah, I hear. So I don't know. Overall, like, yeah, my encountering with, your proposals here, like I was able, to feel a lot more resonance, um, than I initially did, and so the applause is like, very much,
Oh, thank you. I'm
very
so
much
humble.
authentic.
You give me too much credit, my friend. But